Hi, I'm Mark Latender, a systems consultant for RISC, and today in VTA I want to talk about requirements and the basics of due date calculation. Due dates are seen throughout the system. You'll see them on learning plans. People will see them on reports, whether they be status reports or exception reports. If you have emails turned on for your requirements, and if you're using any of our visualizations related to requirement information, due dates are calculated the same way across the system. Without concentrating on the system itself, the VTA due date calculation is done by knowing where the requirement is assigned, gathering the related data, comparing the four major dates or parts of the calculation process, and whichever is latest is the due date. The entire process can be done with a single source, and that is when you run the student status report and output it to a CSV format, you're going to get a file with the requirement information and all the relevant data around those requirements, such as the frequency, the grace period, when was it assigned, etc. Once you have your information gathered, the calculation has four parts. One, the requirement effective date. Every single requirement will have one. You need to know what that date is. Two, what is the grace period on the requirement? That grace period will get added to either the team assignment date, if it's a team requirement, the job title date, if it's a job title requirement, and the individual requirement assignment date, if it's set as an individual requirement. The third part is going to be whether or not the student was exempt for that record. So if they have some type of override, that'll play a part in the process. And fourth, how often is it required to be done from the last time they completed it? So if something has a 24-month frequency and they completed it in 2019, they'll need to complete it again in 2021. So how do you calculate the due date? Simply put, once you know the four parts for the requirement, you can easily compare those to each other, and whichever date is the latest, that will end up being the student's due date. So VTA will say, when was it made effective? When were they assigned? What was the grace period they had? Are they exempt or not? And do they have a completion, and how often they should take it? So on this timeline, if I had those four pieces laid out on a timeline, and there was my part number 3 date, part number 1 date, and part number 4 date, if part number 2 date is the latest date when compared to the other dates, that's what people would see as their due date. Let's break down the parts. Part 1, the requirement effective date. If you've got a team or a job title requirement, that effective date is going to be at the top of every single requirement. Whereas if you have an individual requirement, the field essentially works the same, but it's labeled as the assignment date for the student. The next part, the grace period plus the assignment date. On the requirement, you can see that there's a grace period field. If it's populated, that's the number of days that you would add to the person's assignment date for the requirement. If it's a team requirement, then the grace days will be added to the team assignment date to determine that part of the due date calculation process. If it's a job title requirement, you're going to add that grace period to their job title date on their student profile. And if it's an individual requirement, the grace period is going to get added to the requirement's assignment date. So remember, on an individual requirement, that effective date field is named assignment date. The third part, if they have an exemption, does it have an expiration date? If so, it'll be a date that you just need to note. If you find that the person has an exemption record without an expiration date, that means they are exempt forever and they will never show due for that course. So if you assign it to the job title or to the individual or to the team, or if they're assigned to 3 different teams that has the same requirement, it doesn't matter because an exemption is in place and it overrides all those requirements. Part 4, the completion date plus the frequency. The person would have had to have completed the course to have a date to add the frequency to. If they've never completed it, then the frequency really has no play in the requirement due date calculation process, because you can't add months to something that does not exist. If you notice that the frequency is 0, that means they only really had to do it once. So if you see that they were assigned the requirement, it had a frequency of 0, and you see a last completed date, then that means they're all set. If you assign a requirement, they had completed it 2 years ago, and it's a one-time requirement, that means even though you assigned it today, they've already got history for it. They're not going to show due. If the frequency is greater than 0, then that's how often in months that it needs to be completed. If it needs to be done annually, then you might set a frequency of 12. It gets a little trickier when you have a due month set. If the frequency is divisible by 12 and you have a due month set, what VTA is going to do is determine the year that it's due according to the frequency months. And to determine the date that it's due, it's going to look to the month that you set on the requirement in the due month field and set it to the last date of that month. So if they completed it last year and it's got a due month of October, they're going to have to complete it this year by October 31st. So again, once you have all those dates, you just have to compare them, and whichever is last or latest is going to be the due date that they're going to see in emails, on reports, on their plan, and on visuals. This is true if the course is assigned in one location, meaning just to one team, or just to a job title, or just to an individual. So it's assigned to any given person once. But sometimes courses are assigned more than once, and in that case, VTA will do the calculation process for each assignment of the requirement and then compare the due dates for each requirement. So in the first requirement assignment, it determined that Part 2 was the latest date. Therefore, for this first requirement of the course, Part 2 is seen as the due date. But in the second assignment of that requirement, meaning maybe it was assigned to a team and their job title, VTA will calculate the process for that second assignment, and in that assignment, Part 3 might be the cause of the due date. And then what VTA will do will compare the two due dates and say whichever is stricter, whichever is the earlier of the two, this is what people will see as their due date. If the course is assigned in multiple locations, you need to get the data to calculate the due dates for all of the requirements. Those are the basics of the due date calculation process for VTA requirements. Thanks for watching.